Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. Happy to be back on the show. It's been a little bit of a minute. I've been quite busy, and so I had to take a little bit of a pause after my pause doing Sundance. So I'm a little bit rusty, but excited to get back into things. I know there are plenty of prompts that Natalia has been collecting that she has let me know are going to be fun for us to get into. So I don't want to waste another second. Let's just dive in. So if you don't know the format of the show, what I usually do is I take a look at a prompt, usually from the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com, which is what we're doing today. And I react to the prompt for the first time live on air. So I have not read this yet, but Natalia assures me it's going to be a fun one. So let's see if they're right. Okay, so let me bring it up here. All right. So this comes to us from Terrible Length 4413, and they are asking for some help with their series Antagonists. So they write, in my story, the protagonist's journey for power has him traversing all over my world, seeing a large variety of unique locations with their own cultures and such, meeting a variety of new people and enemies. This is all well and good. However, even though they'd be facing numerous antagonists, usually with ties to the region, I really want there to be an overarching antagonist group, such as the world government from One Piece, the Empire from Star Wars, or even the Fire Nation from Avatar. Okay. The only problem is I'm having a hard time with working out the details about how a powerful empire/country could exist and still explain the heroes encountering regional villains like warlords and other large city-sized locations that somehow have managed to not be conquered by them. I worked at a pros/cons list with 3 structures, but I'm not super happy about any of them. 1. The Legion is a literal world government who has complete control. Pros: makes the villains more intimidating and gives them a larger sense of grandeur and presence in the story. More Legion presence means that most of the villains would be members of the government or would have ties to them in some way. This would be good because it would make the progression and power scaling more cohesive, since they're just fighting people who are higher and higher in the Legion hierarchy. Think Demon Slayers, lower and upper moons, or One Piece's admirals/yonkos. For those of you, by the way, who aren't as familiar with anime, I think, I guess if you do the Star Wars example, you'd be talking about like not quite Darth Vader, but if Darth Vader had like generals under him. So I guess in the Star Wars prequels, that would be like Count Dooku to like Darth Sidious, that kind of thing, I guess. Cons. Here are the cons. Severely limits the amount of creativity I can put into the villains. They all have to fit into the government somehow, or have to tie into it, which means I can't really have local warlords or corrupt rulers of other regions. A big part of the story is uncovering knowledge of the old world and trying to collect, not sure yet, before the Emperor and his army does, so if he already rules everything, he doesn't really have much to try and find and or get. If every region is owned by the Legion, I can't reasonably explain the different architecture and cultures from location to location that well. Okay, so that was their first point, and then here's their second. And sorry, this is a long post. Hopefully, I'm doing my best to help you all follow along. But to catch up, they have 2 different approaches that they want to write these antagonists. And they did a pros and cons list for each. So we just did number 1, where the Legion is a world government with complete control. This is number 2. The Legion is simply the most powerful superpower in the world, like an even grander America. Pros: this leaves room for other powerful factions to exist without being totally crushed by the Legion, things like raiders, warlords, and other powerful governments. A big part of the story is seeking out knowledge about the old world, such as technology, ancient gods, and such, so works better narratively this way. I can have a bunch of unique locations with their own histories and cultures and stylized architecture, giving each area a sense of self. So this makes me think, John Negroni speaking, this makes me think of the Institute in Fallout 4. That might, if we can use video games, like that's kind of what the Institute is. Like there are a lot of factions in Fallout 4, but the Institute is the big bad. Like they're they don't have a total world control government kind of thing, but they do face the biggest threat. They have the most power. So here are the cons. So in my story, they go from location to location. They're talking about the heroes, I guess. If they're one nation, and then I'm not sure how to include a sizable amount of Legion influence in the world until they finally reach them near the end of the story. How can I reasonably build up their presence and make them seem powerful from earlier in the story if there's no reason for them to be so far outside their region? Instead of feeling like a overarching antagonist throughout the story, they're just going to feel like the final, most powerful big bad in a series of big bads instead. I feel without a cohesive hierarchy of villains, the villains may get too samey as the story goes on. For example, there's a warlord of a region. He has two powerful royal guards. That's all well and good. But then the next villain is the leader of small city-sized region. She has the three most powerful royal guard type people in her faction, and the next villain, and so on. I'm not quite sure how to prevent that from getting old, even if they have their own unique aesthetics, dynamics, and such. As you can see, these both have pros and cons. I just really can't decide. In scenario two, I thought about having certain warlords slash city nations working with or under the Legion and having a group of them with a unique name. But I feel like it would be too similar to One Piece's warlords. And with my cast already traveling the world, seeing unique locations and fighting against an authoritarian government, I'm worried my story would be too similar to One Piece's. Hell, I'm worried about adding in an elite slash wealthy group similar to the Court of Owls from Batman, but One Piece did that too. Either way, I need some opinions, thoughts. First thing, right off the bat, you are worried a lot about fictional stories and how those interact with your, like, what inspires you. Try to get your brain away from those inspirations just for a season and try to look into real history, because real history is a treasure trove of this stuff and it tends to be less directly recognizable depending on the subject. So the Court of Owls thing that you just mentioned, that was inspired by real life history stuff. Everything like One Piece is inspired by real history things. And so is Star Wars. Like all this stuff has like an origin point. And the thing is, you're in a box right now with these fictional properties, and that's why you're struggling to get out of it. What you can do to get out of it is you can start to research a lot of the stuff that inspired that. It's kind of the same idea as if Star Wars inspires you, go to what inspired Star Wars for more inspiration. What inspired Star Wars? A bunch of things like John Carter Goes to Mars and Flash Gordon. And if you don't know what these things are, you can look into them and then you can start to see the patterns, and then you can get inspired by something kind of new that crawls out of that. And that's an example of still staying within fictional stuff. But if you go past John Carter Goes to Mars, you can find more real life things too, obviously. But that's just a starting point for you as the writer. But let's dig into this in some detail. This is a very interesting prompt. I can see why Natalia wanted me to, get my feet wet with this one, because we've talked about antagonists a little bit. We haven't really talked about how to organize your antagonist within a world to have like a hierarchy of antagonists and how those things can interplay. I know I already mentioned Fallout 4. And the reason is because I think the Fallout games, if you haven't played them, they do a really good job at this. They do a good job at, especially Fallout New Vegas, probably the best game, Fallout game ever made. And what's great about that game is every faction is very unique and well written, and they all fit into the world cohesively. If one thing happens with one faction that can impact all the other factions, there's a little bit of gray area between, which there's like a spectrum, I should say, of like the actual, like they're totally villainous to the faction that's like, they're kind of in the middle, like they're kind of morally gray. Then you have the factions that are a little bit more sympathetic and a little bit more like, oh, I want to root for them, like that kind of thing. So Fallout is a great inspiration point for this. And what's great about that too is that, you mentioned warlords and things like that. That's where a lot of Fallout comes from, is understanding the geopolitics of how factions kind of interplay. But we don't have to get too much into the granular there. Let's dive into this one by one. So let's talk about the problem you're having. I think that when you have a major antagonist, here's a little bit of a piece of advice. Whether the antagonist themselves is a singular villain, just one person, or it's this large empire, or it's maybe a shadowy organization, either way, your antagonist has to feel present in the story from the very beginning. You have to maintain that. So either one of these things, whether it's like they're in complete control, or if it's just like one of many factions, they have to feel present in the story from the very beginning. The audience, the readers, they have to feel the reach of that antagonist, even when the protagonist isn't directly confronting them. So you need to hold on to that principle. That's way more important than trying to figure out, these kind of like branching things like you're doing. And I think that that's where the structure kind of becomes key. And I'll get into that in a second. I think that the problem with a fully controlling empire, so if you're looking for more cons, you can do it, by the way, but one of the problems with that kind of approach is that it does limit diversity, as you're kind of pointing out. If they rule everything, then every antagonist under them has to serve a very specific purpose in their structure. And you can do this well. I mean, think about how with Demon Slayers, you mentioned the lower and the upper ranks, they all work under Muzan, right? But they all have their own like different abilities. They all have their different motivations. They clash with each other. It is kind of true to life how that works. and it does feel cohesive. Like you can see why they work together, but also why they would rather not work together, but they kind of have to under circumstance. And that said, you do have to, in this approach, sacrifice the rogue elements, and you don't have as many unpredictable wild cards that you might want. But it does work. You can do a Demon Slayer type of story where it is simple, and there can be something nice about that simplicity where it's just the Demon Slayers and the demons. We don't have like five other factions. And if you do want to focus in, lock in on that kind of story, that's totally valid. Like, I don't think that you have to necessarily do the other approach just because you think, your story has to do it, you're obligated. You just have to, as you're trying to understand the limitations and then adjust accordingly. I think on the flip side of that, if the empire that you're working with, if they are just a dominant superpower, so they're not the only game in town, then what you risk there is it starts to feel like, yeah, they're not that big of a threat. Maybe they're not as relevant as a threat. And that can be okay as well. But you have to understand, and I think they do, that is the case. You can just have a ruler be, maybe a bit more independent within their region. And your villains might also start to feel a little repetitive if you go this way, because if there's no connecting tissue between them, maybe repetitive isn't even, it can also feel a little bit like, you have to work a lot harder to make all the villains feel really intrinsically tied to the world. So you have to do a lot of work in this case. If you're going to make it complicated, and there's like lots of factions, you have to make it complicated in a way that's easy to understand, and you have to make it complicated in a way that feels fun to discover. So there's a lot more on you as the writer to pull that off. But again, you can do it. Like, there are ways to do it. It's not like it's impossible for sure. So what is a solution then? Because I don't want to just say like, yeah, both approaches have their problems and they have their upsides and their downsides. If I had to distill this down, I would go back to, I have been watching Brandon Sanderson's new YouTube lectures. I know I've mentioned them on the show before. He's been doing a great job with them. They've been really fun to watch. And, he's talked about this in the most recent lectures, and he's also talked about them in a lot of previous stuff too. He talks a lot about promise, progress, and payoff in storytelling. And one thing that he talks about, especially like that thing I was saying before, how like your empire does need to be felt early in the story. There has to be a promise of how that empire is going to impact the story. And the example he's used before that I think is apt is, the very beginning of Star Wars: A New Hope, seeing one small ship being followed and chased by one big ship. That's a visual metaphor. It's a tone promise that this empire is much bigger than the rebellion. Right. So you can do something like that without having to reveal like a lot of other things right off the bat. And even if the protagonist, in this case Luke Skywalker, doesn't face the Empire directly until much later, starting in this way, that is a layer of control that you want to have. So here's what I suggest as it applies to your story. Instead of making the Legion this monolithic force or a distant power, I would say that you probably want a system where there are different regions with varying levels of control, layers of control, and corruption as well. That can really enhance your story. Imagine a map where there are some territories that are fully absorbed by the Legion. Some are semi-independent, but they pay tribute or they cooperate. It can be a very tenuous alliance. And there are others that are outright defiant. So what this does is it gives you a natural built-in excuse for why some of the warlords and the rulers still exist outside their direct control. And another cheat code to this is that if you kind of start in a place where this Legion isn't all powerful, but then makes moves over the course of your story to become all powerful, where they start to seize that power, that makes it really interesting for the reader because the threat starts to feel bigger. I know I said before, it's like, well, then they don't feel like a big threat. What you can do is you can set it up so that they take over the course of your story, and that's what makes them feel like a big threat. Honestly, it's a kind of have your cake and eat it too kind of moment if you can pull that off effectively. And yeah, this lets you create villain archetypes as well within the varying regions. So that's another plus. They can feel very distinct from one another. So it can feel like in your larger story, there is some of that discovery that you want to have. If your characters are going from place to place, you do need that diversity. That's what makes me think that like you probably should just go with there are different factions and it's complicated, but that seems to be the nature of the story you want to tell. I do think that you should be looking at the conflict between these groups distilled down to two things: control versus chaos. That's always an approach I really like. So for example, maybe one villain is like a Legion general who is kind of pretending to be independent, but secretly is reporting back. And then maybe there's another who is a warlord who thinks that they're free, but is actually a pawn in the Legion's plans. And then maybe there's a rogue element in the Legion that you can reveal who wants to kind of crush the opposition, but they're too busy fighting another war. This is very Wheel of Time, what I'm describing. Wheel of Time is all about control versus chaos. And the way, if you approach your story this way, it really lets you keep your overarching antagonist relevant without making every villain feel the same, because they have different motivations and they have different conflicts, and your main characters can interact with them more organically over the course of the story. So that's just one way to do it. I do think like another great concern you bring up here is that you want to make the Legion, it seems to me, you want to make the Legion interested in searching for this like lost knowledge, I think you mentioned in the prompt. But if they already control everything, it's kind of like how the Nazis in Raiders of the Lost Ark are trying to find the Ark of the Covenant, right? It's before World War II. And it's that kind of thing. They're searching for some kind of like lost knowledge that can help them in the big conflict. So that's pretty cool. That's a way that you can, not cool in a literal way, but I mean like it's a cool way to approach the story, because Raiders of the Lost Ark is really fun to watch. But yeah, if you're going to go this way, I would say you want to bring in some narrative tension. And just because they own the world or they own a large part of it doesn't mean that they understand the world that they have. Empires tend to get bloated and bureaucratic. They have lots of fighting factions. This is something we're seeing in oligarchies and stuff all over the world right now. America is going through this kind of thing at the moment. And maybe this Legion that you're trying to write is fractured internally. You do have a person at the top or a couple people at the top who run everything, but the internal politics of the Legion are extremely frayed. And there's a lot of conflict and a lot of battling and politicking. This is what A Song of Ice and Fire does so well. You can definitely buy when major things happen in Game of Thrones and Storm of Swords and those books, because it feels real that these like bickering factions in King's Landing would have motivations to kind of undermine each other for more power. That is also true to life. That's stuff you can find in history. And what you can do with that kind of thing, if you have these kind of internally fractured elements, then they can actually compete with each other to find the lost knowledge before their rivals do. So think of it as like the Nazis and Raiders of the Lost Ark having different factions that could have been racing each other for the same lost knowledge in order to, win the day, or maybe to take over, beat out Hitler. That's kind of like Hydra, actually. What Hydra is trying to do in Captain America: The First Avenger. So yeah, and maybe the Emperor of your Legion or whatever, maybe they have like kept these dark secrets buried for centuries. You could add in layers of complication like that. And then the cracks are starting to show, or maybe you have ancient technology where the ancient technology is like the one thing that that they don't control. The Legion controls everything, but there's like this one thing that they don't have. It's this ancient technology that could stop them. And so that kind of makes your story a bit more urgent, right? The stakes get a little bit higher, not just for the main characters, but for their antagonists. They're like, oh, we gotta find this lost knowledge before it's used against us in order to undermine us and all that. And that also helps to make this all-powerful empire believable to destroy, right? If it's so all-powerful, you need a way for the heroes to actually stop them, right? So what's their weakness? Well, you can build it up as like it's built on a very fragile foundation. And if you have all of these like competing elements, you can start to see like, oh yeah, there is a way to beat them, but it's not going to be easy. And that's the kind of thing that you want the reader to feel. You don't want the reader to feel like, oh yeah, plot armor and overly simplistic solutions to beating the villains that don't feel earned or hard fought. That's kind of what you want to move forward. And yeah, if you go this approach, this means that your protagonist should be trying to find this artifact. They have a good reason to find it. They can uncover something about the old world, secrets about the Legion, how they came to power, and then it prompts the Legion to have to act. And that's where you start to have your overarching antagonist entering the story in a full way. And so that is a way that you can do this in a really, I think, effective story. I think you could consolidate it really well without bloating the word count. And yeah, let's address the One Piece problem that you brought up here, because you mentioned that. And look, I'm a hyper fan of One Piece. I have a One Piece podcast that I do called Ricky Pirate Radio. I almost wore my One Piece hoodie for this, and I didn't. It would have been perfect, huh? But I see what you're saying, or I hear you on like, oh, what if this feels too much like One Piece? And look, One Piece is a massive influence on modern adventure storytelling. It just is. And if you copy a structure, that doesn't mean that you copy the story. You know, the key to making this feel unique is focusing on theme. Now, I know I've talked before about how you don't usually want to start out with theme, but theme can organically come from you, the author, organically. If you start with the structure and it's feeling too much like One Piece, then what you probably want to do is still keep writing in a way that is taking the structure, but you're doing your own story with it. And it's naturally going to feel like its own thing. Brandon Sanderson talked about this, I think, one or two lectures ago, where he mentioned that it seems that way to you, the author, that it's kind of a ripoff. But yeah, I agree with him where he says, like, most of the time we sweat this for very little reason. And usually this is not as obvious to the reader as you might think. And if it does start to feel obvious, then that comes down to you as the writer needing to work on how you write on the line level and how you write on the thematic level. But yeah, okay, let's take it to One Piece then. And if you do want to mess with the theme, I would say that if you distill it down, One Piece is about a lot of things, but probably the main theme of One Piece is freedom versus oppression, right? And you can do something different if you feel like that's too rote. And I would try to, right? Maybe instead of freedom versus oppression, your main theme is more knowledge versus ignorance. You know, that's also a theme in One Piece, but it's not the big one. You could also try unity versus division. The unity versus division is, again, something that is definitely in One Piece, but it's not the predominant thing. And so you just basically go to like these different rounds. You could do personal power versus collective responsibility. That would probably be a little bit more American individualist versus, Eastern collectivism. You could do a theme like that. And yeah, again, if you actually find that thematic core, it's going to stop feeling like a carbon copy. It's going to stop feeling like you're just doing what One Piece did all over again. It's going to start to feel like your story. So yeah, I think that should cover it. So let me just basically lay it out. If I had to distill all this advice down, because I've said a lot, my final take would be: one, give your empire layers of control, like I said. Some of your regions can be fully absorbed into the full on legion. Others could be semi independent. Others could kind of be in rebellion. This would make your world feel chaotic, lived in, organic, and then you can set up your overarching antagonist to consolidate power and become a bigger threat over the course of the story, instead of baking it into the preamble and just being like, they are the legion. They took all the power because reasons, believe us. Number two, make sure your villains are connected in some kind of unique way. They can serve this empire knowingly. Some of them could serve it unknowingly. Some could be thinking that they're free and they have all the power, but they're actually being manipulated. Take it to Avatar. This would be like Long Feng in season 2. He thinks that he's in control when he's working with Azula, but it turns out he's the one being manipulated the whole time. So no other spoilers for season 2, I know, just in case, right? And number 3, keep your empire's search for knowledge and that ancient technology, make it a real tangible force, not just a plot excuse. So it should feel intrinsic to the story. It should feel like something that's taken seriously by all parties involved. That's how it would work out. And then lastly, number 4, make sure your theme is distinct so it doesn't just feel like a remix of existing stories. And if you don't know what your theme is and you are a little unsure, outlining can help you out with this a lot. Outlining can help you find the theme rather than you try to come up with a theme and then outline after. That's a lot harder to do, and I usually do not recommend that unless that's just something you think that you uniquely feel comfortable doing. Then don't listen to me and just do that. But either way, you have to feel things out in your own way, in your own time, in order for these things to work out. So there you go. Hopefully that advice is helpful. I don't think that there are any comments here. So we actually don't have anything to, I'll refresh the page. Maybe somebody put a comment since we started. And that is not the case. So, oh well. But thank you so much for listening to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians, giving producer Bridget a break since we haven't been doing a lot of episodes, and they're in the middle of some like big important stuff. So we don't have like time to do a fact check for this one, but hopefully we'll have time later in the week to do that, and we can put out some more episodes soon. But as always, if you like Fantasy Writing for Barbarians, I love reading your comments, of course, on the YouTube channel. And I love, of course, that so many of you are subscribing and writing into the show. If you have your own advice prompt, something you want to reach out to us specifically, we have a backlist and we're consolidating these things. You can always email us, fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com, or you can leave comments on the YouTube channel. And I'm always trying to save them so that I can address them, of course. And looking forward, of course, to getting to some of those pretty soon. And if you like the show and you want to support us, the easiest way to do that is just give us a rating, say something nice about us if you like us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, whatever you like, and just keep on subscribing. And hopefully we're going to keep doing fun things for you. So, all right, that's it for me for now. See you all in the next one. Well, yeah, and be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing. I have to do the catchphrase.